The candles in the great hall had barely been lit when the first scream rang out from the east corridor. Eleanor Ashwood froze mid-step, her hand still resting on the marble banister, her heart slamming against her ribs. A maid came running down the hallway, her face white as the powder on the ballroom walls, gasping out words that made no sense at first. "My lady, come quickly. Something has happened in the West Wing." Eleanor did not wait for an explanation. She gathered her skirts and moved faster than any duchess was supposed to move, her slippers slapping against the cold stone floor as she followed the maid through a maze of hallways she knew better than her own reflection. This was her home. She had walked these halls for 6 years, since the day she married Edmund Ashwood, Duke of Bramwell, in a ceremony that half of England had attended and the other half had read about for weeks afterward. But nothing about tonight felt like the home she knew. When she reached the West Wing, she found her husband's study door wide open, papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Edmund stood near the window, his back to her, his shoulders tight with something she had never seen in him before. Fear. "Edmund," she said, her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest. "What is going on?" He turned slowly, and in that moment, Eleanor saw a man she barely recognized. His face had lost its usual composure, the calm control that had made him such a respected figure among the lords of London. His eyes were red, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a letter. "She is here," he said quietly. "Vivienne is here, in this house, tonight of all nights." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she did not move an inch. She had heard the name before, whispered in corners of drawing rooms, mentioned in passing by women who thought she could not hear them. Vivienne Hart, a woman from her husband's past, a woman who was supposed to remain exactly that, a memory locked away and never spoken of again. Why would she come here? Eleanor asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would not bring her comfort. Edmund did not answer right away. Instead, he walked to his desk, picked up an invitation card, and held it out to her with a hand that shook just slightly. Eleanor took it and read the elegant script, her own husband's handwriting staring back at her like an accusation. "You invited her," Eleanor whispered. "You invited her to our winter ball." "It was a mistake," Edmund said quickly, stepping toward her. "A mistake made months ago, before I truly understood what I was doing. I meant to withdraw the invitation, but somehow, in the chaos of preparing for tonight, it slipped past me." Eleanor studied his face, searching for the truth beneath his words. 6 years of marriage had taught her to read every flicker of his expression, every hesitation in his voice. What she saw now was not deception exactly, but something close to it, a carefully built wall with cracks beginning to show. "The guests will begin arriving within the hour," she said finally, setting the invitation down on his desk with more control than she felt inside. "I suggest you compose yourself, Your Grace. Whatever history you carry, tonight belongs to this house, and to our family name." She turned and left the room before he could respond, her footsteps echoing down the corridor as she made her way back toward the main hall. Her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts at once, each one sharper than the last. How long had he known Vivienne Hart? Why had her name never crossed his lips in 6 years of marriage? And most importantly, why had he invited her now, to the one night when all of society would be watching? Eleanor found her lady's maid, Grace, waiting near the grand staircase, with a look of concern etched across her young face. "My lady, is everything well? You look pale." "I am perfectly well," Eleanor said, forcing a smile that felt foreign on her lips. "Help me with my hair. The guests will arrive soon, and I refuse to greet them looking anything less than composed." Grace nodded and led her back to her chambers, where the mirror reflected a woman Eleanor barely recognized. Her cheeks had lost their color. Her eyes carried a weight she had not felt since the early days of her marriage, when she was still learning what it meant to belong to a family as powerful and as scrutinized as the Ashwoods. As Grace worked quickly to fix a stray curl, Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to the day she first arrived at Bramwell Hall as a bride. She had been young then, only 20 years old, filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty about the man she had agreed to marry. Their union had been arranged, as most were among their class, but over time, Eleanor had come to believe that genuine affection had grown between them. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that whatever came before their marriage no longer mattered. Now she wondered if she had been wrong all along. A knock came at her door, and Lady Charlotte Winslow entered without waiting for permission, as she always did. Charlotte was Eleanor's closest friend, a woman with sharp wit and sharper eyes, the kind of friend who noticed everything and forgave nothing less than complete honesty. "Eleanor, darling, you will not believe what I just heard below stairs," Charlotte began, then stopped abruptly when she saw Eleanor's face in the mirror. "What has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," Eleanor said quietly. "Tell me, Charlotte, what did you hear?" Charlotte hesitated, glancing at Grace, before lowering her voice. "They say a woman named Vivian Hart has been added to tonight's guest list. The housekeeper found the name added in the Duke's own hand, separate from the official list prepared weeks ago. My lady, forgive me for asking, but do you know this name?" Eleanor met her friend's gaze in the mirror, and something in her expression must have answered the question before words could form, because Charlotte's face fell with understanding. "Oh, Eleanor. It seems my husband has a history he never thought to share with me," Eleanor said, her voice carefully controlled. "A history that has now decided to walk through our front doors on the very night all of London will be watching." Charlotte moved closer, placing a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "You do not have to attend tonight if you cannot bear it. I could tell the guests you have taken ill." "No," Eleanor said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. "I will not hide in my chambers while gossip spreads through every drawing room in London. Whatever this woman intends, whatever my husband has done, I will face it standing tall, not cowering behind closed doors." Grace finished the final touches on Eleanor's hair, and Charlotte helped her into her gown, a deep emerald silk that had been specially made for tonight's occasion. As the fabric settled around her, Eleanor caught her reflection once more, and barely recognized the calm, composed woman staring back at her. Inside, her heart still raced with questions and fears she could not yet answer. But outside, she looked every bit the Duchess she had trained 6 years to become. "Whatever happens tonight," Charlotte said softly, "know that you do not stand alone." Eleanor squeezed her friend's hand in gratitude, then turned toward the door, ready to descend into a night that would test everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and herself. As she made her way down the grand staircase, the first carriages began arriving outside, their wheels crunching against the gravel drive. Eleanor could hear the distant sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments in the ballroom below, preparing for a night of music and dancing that now felt more like a battlefield than a celebration. She found Edmund waiting at the bottom of the stairs, dressed impeccably in his formal attire, though his eyes still carried traces of the panic she had witnessed earlier. He offered his arm as she reached the final step, and she took it, knowing that appearances mattered more tonight than perhaps any other night of their marriage. "Eleanor," he said quietly as they walked toward the receiving line, "whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that my feelings for you have never wavered." "We will discuss feelings another time, Edmund," she replied, her voice cool but not unkind. "Tonight, we have guests to receive." The first guests began filing through the grand entrance, their voices rising in cheerful greetings and compliments about the decorations. Eleanor smiled and nodded, playing her role with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent years learning to hide her true emotions behind a pleasant expression. Lords and ladies from across the county arrived one after another, each offering congratulations on the beautiful hall, the excellent timing of the ball, the honor of being invited to such a prestigious event. But Eleanor's mind remained elsewhere, watching every new arrival with careful attention, wondering which face among the crowd belonged to the woman who had once held her husband's heart. Hours seemed to pass in mere minutes as the receiving line continued, guests pouring into the ballroom in a steady stream of silk and jewels. Eleanor greeted duchesses and countesses, generals and diplomats, all while her thoughts circled back again and again to the name that had shattered her evening before it had even properly begun. Vivian Hart. She did not know what the woman looked like, whether she was tall or short, dark-haired or fair, whether her voice carried warmth or coldness. She knew nothing except a name written in her husband's hand on an invitation that should never have existed. As the last of the early guests settled into the ballroom, Eleanor excused herself briefly to check on the final preparations in the dining hall. She needed a moment away from the crowd, a moment to breathe and steady herself before the true test of the evening began. She walked through the quiet corridor leading toward the kitchens, her footsteps softer now against the plush carpet. That was when she overheard two servants speaking in hushed tones near the pantry door. They say she arrived in her own carriage, quite grand for a woman of her reputation, one voice said. Hush now, someone might hear you, the other replied. But yes, I saw her myself when I brought fresh linens to the entrance hall. A stunning woman, dark hair, wearing a gown the color of midnight. The footman could not stop staring. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall, listening, despite every instinct telling her to walk away. Do you think the Duchess knows? How could she not? The whole staff has been talking of nothing else since this afternoon. Eleanor stepped back slowly, retreating toward the ballroom before the servants could notice her presence. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her gown, forcing herself to breathe evenly despite the storm building inside her chest. So it was true. Vivian Hart had already arrived, already stepped through the doors of Bramwell Hall, already begun her quiet infiltration of a night meant to celebrate Eleanor's own family and legacy. She returned to the ballroom just as the orchestra began the first waltz of the evening, the music swelling through the grand chamber like a wave rolling toward shore. Couples moved gracefully across the polished floor, their laughter and conversation blending into a cheerful symphony that felt almost mocking against the turmoil in Eleanor's heart. She scanned the room carefully, searching each face among the swirling dancers and gathered guests, wondering which woman might be the one whose name had upended her entire evening. Her eyes moved past countesses in pale blue silk, past young debutantes giggling behind painted fans, past elderly matrons discussing the latest scandals of the season. And then she saw her. Standing near the edge of the dance floor, engaged in quiet conversation with a group of gentlemen, was a woman unlike any other in the room. Her gown, a deep midnight blue that seemed to shimmer with each small movement, set her apart from the pastel silks favored by the other ladies. Her dark hair was styled elegantly, a single sapphire pin catching the candlelight as she tilted her head to laugh at something one of the gentlemen had said. Eleanor did not need anyone to confirm her identity. She simply knew, in the way one knows danger before it fully arrives, that this was Vivian Hart. As if sensing the weight of Eleanor's gaze, the woman turned slightly, and their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow, the music fading into the background, as two women, who shared a connection neither had chosen, studied each other from a distance. Vivian's expression remained calm, almost curious, betraying none of the guilt or discomfort Eleanor might have expected. Eleanor forced herself to look away first, turning toward a nearby group of guests and offering polite conversation about the weather and the excellent quality of the evening's refreshments. But even as she spoke, laughed, and nodded at the appropriate moments, her mind remained fixed on the image of that midnight blue gown and the calm, unreadable expression of the woman wearing it. Edmund appeared at her side moments later, his face carefully neutral, though Eleanor noticed the slight stiffness in his posture as his gaze flickered briefly toward the edge of the dance floor before returning to her. "You seem distracted, my dear," he said quietly, offering her a glass of champagne. "I wonder why that might be," Eleanor replied, accepting the glass but not drinking from it. "Tell me, Edmund, does she know that I know?" Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor, please, not here, not now." "Then when, husband? At what point during this evening do you imagine would be an appropriate time to discuss the woman standing in our ballroom, wearing a gown finer than most duchesses could afford, laughing with our guests as though she belongs among them?" "I did not intend for this to happen," Edmund said, his voice low and urgent. "I told you, it was a mistake." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hint of the truth she desperately needed to understand. "Was it a mistake, Edmund, or was some part of you hoping she would come?" Before he could answer, Charlotte appeared beside them, her expression carefully composed, though her eyes carried a warning message meant only for Eleanor. "The Countess of Winterbourne wishes to speak with you, Your Grace," she said to Eleanor, gently steering her away from her husband and toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "You cannot let him see how much this affects you," Charlotte whispered once they were out of earshot. "Not yet, not with so many eyes watching." "I know," Eleanor whispered back, though the effort of maintaining her composure felt like carrying an enormous weight across her shoulders. "But Charlotte, she is here. I saw her. She is more beautiful than I imagined." and she carries herself as though she has every right to stand in this ballroom. Perhaps she believes she does, Charlotte said carefully. Whatever history exists between her and your husband, we do not yet know the full truth of it. Eleanor nodded, though her mind continued to race through possibilities, each one darker than the last. As the evening continued, and the dancing resumed around them, she found herself watching Vivian Hart from a distance, studying her movements, her laughter, the way gentlemen seemed drawn to her presence like moths circling a flame. She did not yet know what tonight would bring, what confrontations awaited her, before the final guests departed, and the candles burned low. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the woman in the midnight blue gown had not come to Bramwell Hall by accident, and whatever game was unfolding tonight, Eleanor intended to play her part with every ounce of grace and strength she possessed. The orchestra shifted into a new melody, and across the room, Vivian Hart turned once more, her gaze finding Eleanor's, with an expression that could only be described as an invitation. An invitation to what? Eleanor did not yet know. But she understood, in that single silent exchange, that the true story of this evening had only just begun. The music had barely reached its second measure when a wine glass shattered somewhere near the refreshment table, the sound cutting through the ballroom like a blade. Eleanor turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat, half expecting to find some public scene already unfolding between her husband and the woman in midnight blue. But it was only a clumsy footman, bowing apologies to a startled countess, while other servants rushed to clean the mess. Eleanor exhaled slowly, forcing her shoulders to relax, though the tension in her chest refused to loosen completely. She realized then how fragile her composure truly was, how close to the surface her fear had risen in a single evening. A broken glass should mean nothing, yet tonight, every small disturbance felt like the opening note of disaster. Charlotte remained close beside her, guiding her gently through the crowd with practiced conversation, introducing her to guests she had already greeted twice, steering her away from corners where Vivian Hart's laughter still drifted through the air, like smoke that refused to clear. "You must eat something," Charlotte said quietly, pressing a small plate of food into Eleanor's hands. "You have not touched anything since the reception began, and I can see your hands trembling." Eleanor looked down at the plate, at the delicate pastries and slices of fruit arranged so carefully by the kitchen staff, and felt an overwhelming urge to simply walk away from the entire evening. But duty held her in place, the same duty that had shaped every decision of her adult life since the day she became Duchess of Bramwell. "I will manage, Charlotte," she said, setting the plate aside untouched. "I have managed far more difficult things than a single evening." "Have you, though?" Charlotte asked, her voice gentle but probing. "Eleanor, I have known you for nearly 10 years, since we were girls sharing secrets in your mother's garden. I have never seen you look this shaken." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice interrupted them both, smooth and warm, carrying just enough confidence to command attention without seeming rude. "Your Grace, what a magnificent gathering you have arranged tonight." Eleanor turned to find Vivian Hart standing directly before her, close enough now that Eleanor could see the fine details of her gown, the delicate embroidery along the neckline, the way the fabric caught the candlelight with every subtle movement. Up close, the woman was even more striking than she had appeared from across the room, her dark eyes carrying an intelligence that Eleanor had not expected. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice remarkably steady, despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced." "Forgive my boldness," Vivian said, offering a small, elegant curtsy. "I am Vivian Hart. I had the pleasure of knowing your husband some years ago, before his marriage to you, of course." The casual mention of the past hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Eleanor felt Charlotte stiffen beside her, ready to intervene should the conversation take a dangerous turn. But Eleanor held up a hand slightly, a silent signal that she wished to handle this moment herself. "How wonderful," Eleanor said, her tone perfectly pleasant, betraying nothing of the turmoil churning inside her. "I do hope you are enjoying the evening, Miss Hart." "Immensely," Vivian replied, her dark eyes studying Eleanor, with an intensity that felt almost like admiration. "Your home is even more beautiful than I remember it being described. Edmund always did have excellent taste." The familiar use of her husband's given name struck Eleanor like a small blow, though she refused to let her expression waver. She had spent 6 years learning to control every muscle in her face, every flicker of emotion that might betray her thoughts to prying eyes, and she called upon every ounce of that training now. "He does indeed," Eleanor said smoothly, "though I suspect the credit for tonight's arrangements belongs largely to our excellent staff and my dear friend Lady Charlotte here." Charlotte offered a tight smile, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange, but following Eleanor's lead in keeping the conversation civil. Vivian's gaze shifted briefly to Charlotte, acknowledging her presence with a polite nod before returning her full attention to Eleanor. "I must say, Your Grace, you carry yourself with remarkable grace," Vivian said, her voice carrying an undertone Eleanor could not quite identify. Was it respect, or something closer to mockery, disguised as flattery? Not every woman could host such an elegant affair while managing the many demands of a household this size. "One learns to manage many things when running a house of this importance," Eleanor replied, matching the woman's tone precisely. "Tell me, Miss Hart, what brings you to London this season? I understand you have been traveling abroad for some time." Something flickered across Vivian's face, quick and almost imperceptible, but Eleanor caught it nonetheless. Surprise, perhaps, that Eleanor knew even this small detail about her history. "Family matters called me back," Vivian said carefully, "and old friendships, of course. One does not forget the connections of youth, however much time passes." "Of course not," Eleanor agreed, her smile never faltering. "Though I imagine circumstances change a great deal over the years. People marry, families grow, priorities shift entirely." The exchange continued for several more minutes, each woman carefully wielding polite conversation, like a duelist testing her opponent's defenses, neither willing to strike the first true blow in such a public setting. Charlotte watched with growing amazement as Eleanor navigated the conversation, with a composure that seemed almost superhuman given the circumstances. Eventually, Vivian excused herself with another elegant curtsy, drifting back into the crowd of guests with the same confident grace that had marked her entrance earlier that evening. Eleanor watched her go, waiting until the woman was safely out of earshot before finally allowing her shoulders to sag slightly. "Eleanor, that was remarkable," Charlotte whispered, taking her friend's arm. "I do not know how you managed to remain so calm." "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted quietly. "My heart has not stopped racing since the moment she spoke my husband's name, as though they were still the closest of friends. Perhaps they are simply old acquaintances, catching up after many years apart," Charlotte offered, though her tone lacked conviction, even as she spoke the words. "Charlotte, please," Eleanor said, a note of exhaustion creeping into her voice. "We both know this is more than simple acquaintance." The way she spoke, the way she looked at me, as though she were measuring me against some memory of a different life Edmund might have led. Before Charlotte could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Eleanor turned to see her husband's mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Margaret, sweeping into the ballroom with her usual air of absolute authority. Margaret had not been expected to attend tonight's ball, having claimed illness earlier in the week, and her sudden appearance sent a ripple of surprise through the gathered guests. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of anxiety settle over her. If anyone in this house possessed the sharpness to notice every detail of tonight's unfolding drama, it would be Margaret, a woman known throughout London for her keen eye and her complete inability to remain silent when she disapproved of something. Margaret's gaze swept across the ballroom, taking in the dancers, the decorations, the arrangement of guests with practiced efficiency. Then her eyes landed on Vivian Hart, still visible near the refreshment table, and Eleanor watched as the older woman's expression shifted from casual observation to something far more alert. "Excuse me a moment, Charlotte," Eleanor said, moving to intercept her mother-in-law before Margaret could approach anyone else in the room. "Eleanor, dear," Margaret said, as her daughter-in-law reached her side, though her eyes remained fixed on the far side of the ballroom. "Tell me, is that not Vivian Hart standing near the pastries?" "It is," Eleanor confirmed, keeping her voice level, despite the sudden tightening in her chest. "She arrived earlier this evening." Margaret's sharp gaze turned to Eleanor, studying her face with the same intensity she had just applied to observing the ballroom. "And you invited her, did you?" "Edmund extended the invitation," Eleanor said carefully. "Some months ago, apparently, before the final guest list was properly reviewed." Something in Margaret's expression softened slightly, a flicker of sympathy crossing her otherwise stern features. "I see." she said quietly. "Eleanor, walk with me to the garden terrace. I believe we should speak privately, before this evening progresses any further." Eleanor followed her mother-in-law through a side door leading to the terrace, grateful for the cool night air, after the warmth and tension of the crowded ballroom. Margaret waited until they were fully alone, before speaking again, her voice dropping to a near whisper, despite the empty terrace around them. "You must understand something about my son," Margaret began, her eyes fixed on the distant garden hedges barely visible in the moonlight. "Before he married you, before the arrangement between our families was finalized, Edmund carried feelings for that woman that ran deeper than most young men's passing infatuations." Eleanor's breath caught, though she tried to maintain her composed exterior. "How deep exactly?" "Deep enough that his father and I feared he might refuse the marriage arrangement entirely," Margaret admitted. "Vivian Hart came from a family of little fortune and less standing among society. Her connection with my son could never have led to marriage, not within the expectations placed upon our family name." "So you separated them," Eleanor said quietly, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in her mind. "We did what was necessary," Margaret said, her tone carrying no apology. "Edmund's duty was to marry well, to secure the family's future and standing. Whatever affection existed between them could not be permitted to threaten that duty." Eleanor stared out at the moonlit garden, processing this new information alongside everything she had already learned tonight. "Does he still love her?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I cannot speak to my son's heart, Eleanor, but I can tell you this. Whatever feelings existed years ago, Edmund made his choice when he married you. He chose duty, family, and the future you now share together." "Yet he invited her tonight," Eleanor said, unable to keep the bitterness from creeping into her voice. "He claims it was an accident, a mistake made months ago, and forgotten. But how does one simply forget inviting the woman who once held their heart?" Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, her sharp eyes studying Eleanor with something approaching genuine concern. "I do not know the answer to that question, my dear, but I do know this. Whatever happens tonight, you must not allow this woman to see how deeply this troubles you. Society is watching, Eleanor, and society is unforgiving toward duchesses who show weakness." "I have shown no weakness," Eleanor said firmly. "I spoke with her not an hour ago, and I maintained perfect composure throughout our entire conversation." "Good," Margaret said, a note of approval entering her voice for the first time since their conversation began. "Continue in that manner, and whatever storm brews tonight will pass without permanent damage to your position or your family's reputation." They returned to the ballroom together. Margaret immediately swept into conversation by a group of elderly matrons, eager to hear her opinions on the evening's festivities. Eleanor found herself alone once more, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on Edmund, standing near the far wall in quiet conversation, with two gentlemen she recognized as business associates. As if sensing her attention, Edmund glanced up, his eyes meeting hers across the distance of the crowded room. For a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the difficult night ahead, perhaps even an apology that words alone could never fully convey. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment before turning away, unwilling to let him see the full extent of her hurt and confusion. She spent the next hour moving through the ballroom with practiced grace, greeting guests, complimenting gowns, discussing the excellent quality of the orchestra's performance. All the while, her attention remained divided. One part of her mind engaged in pleasant conversation, while another part tracked the movements of Vivian Hart across the room, watching for any sign of what might come next. It was during a brief lull in the dancing that Eleanor noticed something that made her blood run cold. Edmund had left his position near the wall and now stood near a small alcove, close to the terrace doors, engaged in quiet conversation with none other than Vivian Hart herself. Their heads bent close together, their voices too low for anyone nearby to overhear, their body language suggesting an intimacy that went far beyond simple pleasantries between old acquaintances. Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched from across the room, torn between the urge to march directly toward them and the knowledge that such a scene would only confirm every whispered rumor already circulating through the ballroom. She forced herself to remain still, to continue her conversation with the Countess beside her, though every word felt hollow and meaningless compared to the scene unfolding just beyond her line of sight. Charlotte appeared beside her once more, following Eleanor's gaze toward the alcove where Edmund and Vivian remained in close conversation. "Eleanor," she said softly, concern evident in her voice. "Do you want me to interrupt them?" "No," Eleanor said, though every instinct screamed otherwise. "Let them speak. I will not chase after my own husband in front of 200 guests like some jealous fishwife." But as the minutes stretched on, and Edmund and Vivian remained locked in their private conversation, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack at the edges. Something was happening tonight, something larger than a simple accidental invitation, or an old acquaintance renewed. She could feel it in the air, in the way certain guests had begun to notice the private conversation near the terrace doors, in the whispers that had started to ripple through the crowd like wind moving through tall grass. Whatever Edmund and Vivian discussed in that quiet corner, Eleanor understood with growing certainty that the true confrontation of this evening had not yet arrived. It waited somewhere ahead, patient and inevitable, gathering strength with every passing moment, until the time came when it could no longer be avoided or postponed. She only hoped, as she watched her husband lean closer to whisper something in Vivian Hart's ear, that she would find the strength to face it when it finally came. A footman nearly dropped an entire tray of champagne glasses when he rounded the corner and found the Duke of Bramwell standing far too close to a woman who was not his wife. Eleanor did not see this moment herself, but she would hear about it later, whispered secondhand through Grace, who had heard it from another maid, who had heard it from the footman himself, badly shaken by what he had witnessed near the terrace doors. By the time the story reached Eleanor's ears, the details had already begun to shift and grow, as gossip always does when it passes through enough hands. But in that moment, standing across the ballroom, with the Countess still chattering pleasantly beside her, Eleanor knew only what her own eyes could tell her. Her husband and Vivian Hart remained close together near the alcove, their conversation continuing, with an intensity that drew increasing attention from nearby guests. "Your Grace," the Countess said, apparently for the second or third time, finally breaking through Eleanor's distracted thoughts. "Are you quite well? You seem rather pale this evening." "Forgive me," Eleanor said, forcing her attention back to the woman beside her. "I fear the excitement of hosting such a grand affair has left me somewhat overwhelmed." "Please, continue what you were saying about your daughter's upcoming engagement." The Countess resumed her story about wedding preparations, and Eleanor nodded along at appropriate intervals, though her mind remained fixed on the scene playing out near the terrace doors. She noticed other guests beginning to glance in that direction as well, their conversations pausing slightly, as curious eyes tracked the Duke's continued absence from his other social obligations. Charlotte returned to her side once more, her expression tight with barely concealed worry. "Eleanor, people are beginning to notice. Lady Pemberton just asked me, quite directly, who that woman speaking with your husband might be." "What did you tell her?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low. "I said she was an old family friend. Nothing more," Charlotte replied. "But Eleanor, you know how quickly these things spread. By tomorrow morning, half of London will have their own version of tonight's events, each one more scandalous than the last." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering her composure, before opening them again, with renewed determination. "Then perhaps it is time I remind everyone present exactly who hosts this ball, and who commands this household." She excused herself from the Countess with practiced grace, moving through the crowd with purposeful steps that carried her steadily toward the alcove, where Edmund and Vivian remained deep in conversation. Charlotte followed a few steps behind, ready to intervene should the situation require it, though she trusted Eleanor's judgment enough to let her friend handle matters in whatever manner she saw fit. As Eleanor approached, she caught fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that the discussion had grown more serious than simple pleasantries. "You cannot simply appear after all these years and expect nothing to have changed," Edmund was saying, his voice tight with an emotion Eleanor could not quite identify. "I never expected nothing to have changed," Vivian replied, her tone carrying a sadness that seemed genuine, despite everything Eleanor had assumed about the woman's intentions. "But some things, Edmund, remain constant, no matter how much time passes." Eleanor cleared her throat softly as she reached them, and both Edmund and Vivian turned in surprise, clearly not having noticed her approach. Edmund's face flushed with something between embarrassment and guilt, while Vivian's expression remained remarkably composed, betraying only the faintest hint of surprise. "Edmund," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the small cluster of guests standing nearby. The Marquis of Ellington has been asking for you. Something about the arrangements for next month's hunting party. It was a small lie, but an effective one, giving Edmund an easy path away from the conversation without drawing further attention to the moment. He nodded quickly, clearly grateful for the interruption, and excused himself with a brief bow toward Vivian before disappearing into the crowd. Eleanor turned to face Vivian directly, and for a moment, the two women simply studied each other in silence, the noise of the ballroom fading into background static around them. "You seem quite concerned with my husband's whereabouts this evening," Eleanor said finally, keeping her tone light despite the weight of the words. "We were simply discussing old times," Vivian replied smoothly. "There is no need for concern, Your Grace." "Is there not?" Eleanor asked, allowing a small edge to enter her voice for the first time that evening. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, given the manner in which you and Edmund have positioned yourselves away from the rest of the gathering for the better part of 20 minutes. Something shifted in Vivian's expression then, the polished composure cracking slightly, to reveal a flicker of genuine emotion beneath. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated, Your Grace. I am simply observant," Eleanor replied. "A skill one develops quickly when running a household of this size and complexity." Vivian studied her for a long moment, her dark eyes carrying an expression Eleanor could not quite decipher. Respect, perhaps, or something closer to reluctant admiration. "May I speak candidly with you, Duchess?" "I would prefer nothing less," Eleanor said. "Edmund and I shared a connection many years ago, before circumstances beyond our control forced us apart." Vivian began, choosing her words with obvious care. "I did not come tonight intending to disrupt your marriage or cause you distress. I came because I received an invitation, and curiosity, along with perhaps some foolish sentiment for the past, convinced me to accept it." "And what have you learned from your curiosity?" Eleanor asked. "That your husband made his choice long ago," Vivian said quietly, "and that choice was you. Whatever feelings linger from our past connection, Edmund has built a life here, a family, a position of respect within society. I would be a poor sort of woman indeed if I sought to unravel that, simply because old memories stirred within me tonight." Eleanor studied the woman before her, searching for any sign of deception in her words. What she found instead was something closer to genuine regret, a sadness that seemed to run deeper than simple social awkwardness. "Why did you accept the invitation, then, if you understood the risk it carried?" Eleanor asked. Vivian was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the dancing couples across the ballroom, before returning to Eleanor's face. "Perhaps I wished to see for myself the life Edmund built without me. Perhaps I needed to understand, finally, that the path not taken led somewhere good and worthy, rather than continuing to wonder what might have been." "And has tonight given you that understanding?" Eleanor asked. "It has," Vivian said, a small, genuine smile, touching her lips for the first time since their conversation began. "You are everything a woman in your position should be, Your Grace. Graceful, intelligent, composed under pressure, that would break lesser women. Edmund chose well, whatever regrets our past might still carry." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, though caution kept her from fully trusting the sincerity of Vivian's words. 6 years of navigating the complex politics of high society had taught her that appearances could be carefully constructed, that even the most genuine-seeming words could mask deeper intentions. "I appreciate your candor," Eleanor said finally, "though I hope you will understand if I remain cautious about the true nature of your visit tonight." "Of course," Vivian said, inclining her head slightly. "Trust is earned, not simply given, especially under circumstances such as these." Before their conversation could continue further, a new voice interrupted them, bright and cheerful, despite the tension hanging in the air. "Your Grace, there you are. I have been searching everywhere for you." Eleanor turned to find Lord Henry Blackwood approaching, a longtime family friend, and one of the few gentlemen in London whose company Eleanor genuinely enjoyed outside the formal obligations of society events. Henry had known Eleanor since childhood, their families connected through decades of friendship and occasional business partnerships. "Henry," Eleanor said, genuine warmth entering her voice for the first time in what felt like hours. "How wonderful to see you. I did not realize you had arrived." "I only just made my way through the receiving line," Henry said, his eyes flickering briefly toward Vivian, with obvious curiosity, before returning his attention to Eleanor. The traffic on the road from town was absolutely dreadful tonight. Half of London seems to be attending your ball. It does feel that way, Eleanor agreed, grateful for the distraction his arrival provided. She turned to introduce him properly. Henry, this is Miss Vivian Hart, Miss Hart, Lord Henry Blackwood, a dear friend of my family. The two exchanged polite greetings, though Eleanor noticed Henry's eyes carried a sharpness that suggested he had already heard some version of tonight's unfolding drama, likely from other guests, eager to share the latest gossip. Vivian excused herself shortly after, citing a need to find refreshment, leaving Eleanor alone with Henry near the alcove. Eleanor, Henry said, once Vivian had moved out of earshot, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. I have heard whispers tonight, troubling ones. Is everything well between you and Edmund? Whatever have you heard? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Only that a woman from the Duke's past has arrived uninvited, and that she and Edmund have spent considerable time in private conversation this evening, Henry said carefully. I do not wish to pry into matters that are not my concern, but I have known you long enough to recognize when something troubles you deeply, Eleanor. Eleanor considered how much to share with her old friend, weighing the comfort of confiding in someone she trusted against the risk of adding fuel to gossip that was already spreading faster than she could control. Finally, she decided that Henry's discretion had never once failed her in all the years of their friendship. It has been a complicated evening, she admitted quietly. One I did not anticipate when I woke this morning, with such simple hopes for tonight's success. Do you wish to speak of it? Henry asked gently. Or would you prefer distraction? I notice the orchestra is about to begin another set, and I would consider it an honor if you would grant me this next dance. Eleanor looked at her old friend, grateful beyond words for his understanding and his willingness to offer exactly what she needed, without pressing for details she was not yet ready to share. I would like that very much, Henry. He led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began a graceful waltz, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor felt herself begin to relax slightly, her body moving through the familiar steps, while her mind found brief respite from the tumultuous thoughts that had consumed her since the moment she learned of Vivian Hart's arrival. You dance as beautifully as ever, Henry said as they moved together across the polished floor. You always were generous with your compliments, Eleanor replied, a genuine smile finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. As they danced, Eleanor's gaze drifted across the ballroom, and she caught sight of Edmund standing near the far wall, watching her and Henry, with an expression she could not quite interpret. Was it jealousy, she wondered, or simple relief that she had found a moment of peace amid the chaos of the evening? Perhaps it was something else entirely, some complicated mixture of emotions that even he could not fully articulate. Their eyes met across the dance floor, and for a brief moment, Eleanor saw something raw and unguarded in her husband's expression. A vulnerability that reminded her of the young man she had married 6 years ago, before the weight of duty and family expectation had settled fully upon his shoulders. Then, the moment passed, and Edmund's expression returned to its usual composed mask, though Eleanor found herself wondering what thoughts truly occupied his mind as he watched her dance with another man. The waltz continued, and Eleanor allowed herself to focus fully on the music and the comfortable familiarity of dancing with an old friend, pushing aside for these few precious minutes the weight of everything that had transpired tonight. But even as she moved gracefully through each step, she remained acutely aware that this brief respite would not last forever, that somewhere in this crowded ballroom, the true confrontation of the evening continued to build toward an inevitable conclusion. When the waltz ended, Henry escorted her back toward the edge of the dance floor, offering a final bow before excusing himself to greet other acquaintances scattered throughout the gathering. Eleanor watched him go, grateful for the brief kindness he had shown her, before turning her attention back toward the larger ballroom and the complicated web of tensions still unfolding around her. She spotted Charlotte near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with 2 other ladies, and made her way toward her friend, hoping for a few more minutes of quiet support before whatever came next in this endless, complicated evening. But as she crossed the room, she noticed something that made her pause mid-step. Edmund had left his position near the wall and now stood near the entrance to the small library adjoining the ballroom, and Vivian Hart was walking directly toward him, her expression determined in a way that suggested their earlier conversation had not yet reached its conclusion. Eleanor watched as her husband glanced around briefly, before following Vivian through the library door, the two of them disappearing from the main gathering entirely, leaving Eleanor standing alone, amid the swirling colors and music of her own ball, wondering what private conversation now continued beyond the closed door, and what consequences might yet emerge before the night finally reached its end. Eleanor's hand closed around the nearest doorframe hard enough that her knuckles turned pale, though no one around her noticed the small gesture in the midst of the crowded ballroom. She stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the closed library door, through which her husband and Vivian Hart had just disappeared together. Every instinct screamed at her to march forward, to fling open that door and demand an explanation in front of whatever gathered guests might witness the confrontation. But years of careful training held her in place, the same training that had taught her to smile through disappointment, to remain composed through uncertainty, to present a united front regardless of the storms brewing beneath the surface. Charlotte appeared at her side within moments, having noticed Eleanor's sudden stillness from across the room. "Eleanor, what has happened? You look as though the floor has opened beneath you." "They have gone into the library," Eleanor said quietly, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Edmund and Vivian, together, alone, behind a closed door." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, before she quickly schooled her expression back into careful neutrality, aware that too much visible reaction might draw unwanted attention from nearby guests. "What will you do?" "I do not know," Eleanor admitted, the honesty of the confession surprising even herself. "Part of me wishes to storm through that door this instant. Another part fears what I might discover if I do." "Would you like me to investigate discreetly?" Charlotte offered. "I could find some excuse to check on the library, perhaps claim I need a book for reference, and report back what I observe." Eleanor considered this option for a moment, before shaking her head slowly. "No. Whatever happens between them, I must face it myself, not through second-hand reports filtered through my dearest friend's careful diplomacy." She took a steadying breath, smoothing her gown, with hands that trembled only slightly, before making her way toward the library door, with measured, deliberate steps. Charlotte followed a short distance behind, ready to offer support should Eleanor need it, though she understood this moment required her friend to face it alone. As Eleanor approached the door, she paused, her hand hovering just above the ornate brass handle. Through the thick wood, she could hear the faint murmur of voices, too muffled to distinguish individual words, but clear enough to confirm that a serious conversation continued within. She thought of her mother-in-law's advice from earlier that evening, about maintaining composure regardless of what challenges arose. She thought of Charlotte's unwavering support, of Henry's kindness during their dance, of the 6 years she had spent building a life and a reputation within these very walls. Whatever waited beyond this door, she would face it as the Duchess of Bramwell, not as some frightened, jealous wife consumed by insecurity. With this resolve firmly in place, Eleanor opened the door. The library was dimly lit, illuminated only by a few strategically placed candles, and the soft glow of a fire burning low in the hearth. Edmund and Vivian stood near the tall windows overlooking the garden, close together but not touching, their conversation pausing abruptly at the sound of the door opening. Both turned toward Eleanor with expressions of surprise, though Eleanor noticed that neither appeared to be engaged in anything that could be considered scandalous or inappropriate. There was no embrace, no stolen kiss, nothing that would confirm the darkest fears that had plagued her thoughts since first learning of Vivian's arrival tonight. "Eleanor," Edmund said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief. "I did not expect you to seek us out here." "Clearly not," Eleanor replied, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her, unwilling to risk their conversation being overheard by passing guests. "Perhaps you might explain to me why you and Miss Hart found it necessary to continue your private discussion, away from the rest of the gathering." Vivian stepped forward slightly, her expression earnest in a way that seemed to carry genuine sincerity rather than practiced deception. "Your Grace, please understand, nothing improper has occurred here. Edmund and I were discussing matters that required privacy, but not for the reasons you might suspect." "Then perhaps you would care to enlighten me," Eleanor said, crossing her arms slightly as she looked between the two of them, "as to what reasons might require such secrecy on the night of my own ball." Edmund and Vivian exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them, that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with renewed anxiety. Finally, Edmund spoke, his voice carrying a heaviness that suggested whatever he was about to share carried significant weight. "Eleanor, please sit down," he said gently, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. "What I am about to tell you may come as something of a shock, and I would prefer you hear the full truth, rather than continuing to imagine scenarios far worse than reality." Eleanor remained standing, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. "I prefer to stand, Edmund. Please, continue." He hesitated a moment longer before nodding, understanding that Eleanor would not be swayed from her position. "Vivienne came here tonight not simply to renew an old acquaintance, though our shared history certainly played some part in her decision to accept the invitation I foolishly extended months ago." "Then what other purpose brought her here?" Eleanor asked. Vivienne answered this time, her voice quiet but steady. "My brother, Captain Richard Hart, served under Edmund's command many years ago, during his time in military service, before Edmund inherited his title. Richard was gravely injured in an incident that has long been shrouded in confusion and misinformation, an incident that ultimately cost him his commission and left our family's reputation severely damaged within certain circles." Eleanor felt a shift in the conversation, the tension in the room transforming from something rooted in romantic jealousy into something far more complex. "What does this have to do with tonight?" "I came seeking Edmund's help," Vivienne continued. "Richard has fallen ill, quite seriously, and the physicians believe his condition stems partly from complications related to that old injury. Without proper documentation clearing his name of the accusations that ended his military career, my family struggles to secure the resources necessary for his continued care. Edmund possesses information, records from that time, that could restore Richard's reputation and provide the financial support our family desperately needs." Eleanor turned to Edmund, searching his face for confirmation of this unexpected revelation. "Is this true?" "It is," Edmund said quietly. "I served alongside Richard Hart for 2 years before purchasing my commission and returning home to assume my responsibilities here. He was a good man, an honorable soldier, wrongly blamed for an incident that was not his fault. I have carried guilt about his fate for years, guilt I never fully shared with you, because the memories connected to that time also included Vivienne, and I feared how such history might complicate our marriage. So you invited her here, under the guise of an old ball invitation, intending to discuss this matter privately, without ever informing me of the true circumstances?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying equal parts confusion and frustration. "I intended to speak with her privately before the ball began," Edmund admitted, shame evident in his voice. "I planned to withdraw the invitation once our business had concluded, sparing you any concern about her presence tonight. But circumstances delayed our meeting, and by the time she arrived this evening, there was no opportunity to prevent her attendance without creating an even greater scene." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, feeling the pieces of tonight's confusing puzzle beginning to shift into a different, more coherent picture. "Why did you not simply tell me the truth from the beginning, Edmund? Why allow me to imagine the worst possible explanations when the reality, while complicated, carries none of the betrayal I feared? Because the truth involves painful memories I have never fully shared with you," Edmund said, his voice thick with emotion. "Memories of a war I rarely discuss, of a friend I failed to protect properly, of feelings for Vivienne that existed long before you and I ever met. Feelings that complicated my ability to speak clearly about any of this without risking your trust in our marriage." Eleanor turned to look at Vivienne, studying the woman's face for any sign of deception, though she found only weariness and genuine concern reflected in her dark eyes. "Miss Hart, do you still harbor feelings for my husband?" Vivienne considered the question carefully before answering. "I will not insult you with false denials, Your Grace. Some part of my heart likely will always remember Edmund fondly, as one remembers first loves and youthful passions. But I came here tonight for my brother's sake, not to reclaim feelings long since surrendered to circumstance and duty. Whatever affection I once carried for Edmund pales beside my need to help Richard recover his health and his reputation." Eleanor found herself believing the sincerity in Vivienne's words, the desperation of a sister fighting for her brother's welfare, ringing true in ways that calculated deception rarely managed to replicate. She turned back to Edmund, her expression softening slightly despite the lingering hurt of his secrecy. "Why did you not simply come to me from the beginning?" she asked quietly. "I am your wife, Edmund. Whatever burdens you carry from your past, I would have helped you navigate them, had you only trusted me enough to share the truth." "I feared your reaction," Edmund admitted. "I feared that learning of my past connection to Vivian, learning that feelings once existed there, might damage the trust we have carefully built together over these 6 years. I was a coward, Eleanor, choosing secrecy over honesty, because I could not bear the thought of losing what we have built." The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed his confession, and Eleanor found herself studying her husband's face with new understanding, recognizing the fear and vulnerability beneath his carefully maintained composure. Whatever mistakes he had made tonight, whatever secrecy he had employed to avoid difficult conversations, she saw now that his intentions had never truly been to betray her trust or humiliate her before their assembled guests. "We will discuss this further, Edmund, once our guests have departed, and we can speak without the constraints of tonight's obligations," Eleanor said finally, her voice carrying quiet authority, despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "But for now, I believe we have a ball to continue hosting, and Miss Hart, I trust you will provide Edmund with whatever documentation he requires to assist your brother's situation." "Thank you, Your Grace," Vivian said, genuine gratitude evident in her expression. "I am truly sorry for the distress my presence has caused you tonight." "That was never my intention." Eleanor nodded, accepting the apology with quiet grace. "Perhaps, once matters have settled, you might consider staying for tea sometime, so we might discuss your brother's situation further and determine how else our family might assist in his recovery." Surprise flickered across Vivian's face, clearly not having expected such generosity from a woman she had unknowingly caused considerable distress throughout the evening. "That would be very kind, Your Grace. Thank you." As Eleanor turned to leave the library, prepared to return to her hosting duties with renewed composure, Edmund caught her hand gently, his eyes carrying silent gratitude and lingering guilt in equal measure. "Eleanor, thank you for your grace tonight. I do not deserve such understanding after the manner in which I have handled this situation." "We will speak more later, Edmund," Eleanor said, though her tone carried less coldness than it had at the conversation's beginning. "Tonight, however, we have guests waiting, and appearances must be maintained, regardless of whatever private matters remain unresolved between us." She left the library, with her head held high, Charlotte falling into step beside her, the moment she emerged into the hallway, relief evident on her friend's face at Eleanor's steadier composure. "What happened?" Charlotte whispered urgently. "You look far less troubled than when you entered." "It is a complicated story," Eleanor said quietly. "One I will share with you fully, once tonight's obligations have concluded. For now, let us return to our guests and finish what remains of this endless evening." But even as she returned to the ballroom, greeting guests with practiced grace and engaging in pleasant conversation about music and refreshments, Eleanor felt a lingering unease she could not quite shake. Edmund's explanation had provided context for tonight's confusion, had transformed what appeared to be betrayal into something more understandable and even sympathetic. Yet the fact remained that he had kept significant secrets from her for the entirety of their marriage, secrets involving deep personal history and complicated emotions that he had chosen to hide rather than share. As the evening progressed toward its conclusion, Eleanor found herself wondering what other secrets her husband might still carry, what other pieces of his past remained hidden behind careful smiles and composed silence. Whatever trust had been damaged tonight would require careful rebuilding in the days ahead, and Eleanor understood, with growing certainty, that tonight's revelations marked only the beginning of a much longer conversation that awaited her and Edmund once the final guests had departed and the candles finally burned low. A single sharp laugh cut through the string quartet's melody, too loud and too deliberate to be accidental, and Eleanor turned just in time to see Lord Pemberton watching her with an expression that made her skin prickle with unease. She had never cared for the man, a minor earl with grand ambitions who had spent the last several years attempting to climb higher within London's political circles by any means available to him. Edmund had mentioned once that Pemberton hoped to secure an important appointment within the coming months, a position that required the support and endorsement of several powerful families, including their own. Eleanor had always sensed something calculating beneath Pemberton's polished manners, and tonight, Watching him observe her with such open curiosity, that instinct returned with renewed force. "Your Grace," Pemberton said, approaching with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "What a fascinating evening this has become." "I am glad you are enjoying yourself, my lord," Eleanor replied carefully, keeping her tone pleasant despite the wariness building within her. "Enjoying myself is perhaps an understatement," Pemberton continued, glancing meaningfully toward the library door Eleanor had emerged from only minutes earlier. "I could not help but notice the Duke's rather extended absence this evening, along with that of a certain beautiful guest, whose name seems to be on everyone's lips tonight." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten, understanding immediately where this conversation intended to lead. "I am not certain what you mean to imply, Lord Pemberton." "Imply? I imply nothing, Your Grace," he said smoothly, though his eyes carried a glint of something predatory. "I merely observe what many others in this room have already observed themselves. Miss Hart's presence tonight has certainly given the assembled guests something to discuss beyond the usual pleasantries of music and refreshment." "Guests will always find something to discuss, my lord," Eleanor replied, matching his tone with careful precision. "Whether their observations carry any true substance is another matter entirely." Pemberton's smile widened slightly, and Eleanor sensed she had just confirmed something he had been testing with his careful words. "Of course, Your Grace. I only mention it because I care deeply for your family's reputation, particularly given the delicate political matters currently under discussion within certain circles of influence." "What political matters would those be?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already understood his meaning. "Simply that reputation carries enormous weight when appointments and positions of influence are being considered," Pemberton said. "A scandal involving infidelity or impropriety, even one based merely on appearances rather than fact, could prove quite damaging to a family standing at precisely the wrong moment." Eleanor understood then exactly what game Pemberton intended to play. He sought the same appointment Edmund had been considered for, a prestigious position within the House of Lords that required not merely wealth and title, but an unblemished reputation among the aristocracy. If rumors of infidelity attached themselves to Edmund's name, however unfounded, it might tip the scales in Pemberton's favor when the final decision was made. "I appreciate your concern for our family's reputation, Lord Pemberton," Eleanor said, her voice carrying steel beneath its polite surface. "Though I assure you, whatever gossip may circulate tonight carries no foundation in truth. My husband and I remain as devoted to each other as the day we married." "I am relieved to hear it," Pemberton said, though his expression suggested he believed nothing of the sort. "Though I wonder, Your Grace, whether the assembled guest tonight will require more convincing than simple words. To believe such devotion remains intact." He excused himself shortly after, leaving Eleanor standing alone, with a growing sense of dread settling over her earlier relief. The private conversation with Edmund and Vivian had resolved her own doubts about their intentions, but it had done nothing to address the public perception, now spreading through the ballroom like wildfire through dry grass. Whatever the truth of tonight's events, appearances alone could damage Edmund's political prospects, and their family's standing within society. Charlotte found her moments later, her expression troubled, as she pulled Eleanor slightly aside from the main flow of guests. "Eleanor, I fear the gossip has grown considerably worse in the time you were speaking with Edmund and Miss Hart. Several guests are now openly speculating about the nature of their relationship, and I overheard Lady Pemberton herself suggesting that the Duke's reputation might not survive such a public scandal." "Lord Pemberton has just made his intentions rather clear to me directly," Eleanor said grimly. "He seeks to use tonight's confusion to damage Edmund's chances at the appointment they both hope to secure." Charlotte's eyes widened with understanding. "That explains why he has been so eager to circulate rumors this evening. But Eleanor, what can we do? The truth of the situation, while innocent, remains complicated and difficult to explain quickly to 200 curious guests." Eleanor considered the problem carefully, her mind racing through possible solutions, even as the orchestra began another lively piece, and couples returned to the dance floor around them. Simply explaining the truth to individual guests would take far too long, and would likely be dismissed as convenient excuse-making, rather than genuine explanation. She needed something more dramatic, something that would speak louder than words, and settle the matter definitively, before Pemberton's poison could spread further. "Where is Miss Hart now?" Eleanor asked, an idea beginning to form in her mind. I believe she returned to the ballroom a few minutes ago, Charlotte said, glancing around the crowded room. Yes, there, near the eastern windows, speaking with the Countess of Ashford. Eleanor studied the scene for a moment, watching Vivian engage in polite conversation, despite what must have been considerable anxiety about the whispers surely reaching her ears as well. Whatever plan Eleanor formed would need to happen soon, before Pemberton's carefully planted seeds of doubt grew too deep to uproot easily. She found Edmund near the refreshment table, engaged in tense conversation with two gentlemen whose expressions suggested they too had heard the circulating rumors. He looked up as Eleanor approached, his face carrying a mixture of exhaustion and lingering guilt from their earlier conversation in the library. Eleanor, I have just heard some rather troubling talk making its way through our guests, he said quietly, once the two gentlemen had moved away, offering the couple privacy for their conversation. Lord Pemberton seeks to use tonight's confusion against you, Eleanor said, keeping her voice low, despite the crowd surrounding them. He hopes the appointment you both desire will fall to him instead, should scandal attach itself firmly enough to your name. Edmund's expression darkened with understanding. That explains why several of my usual allies have seemed unusually distant this evening. I had assumed simple discomfort with the situation, not deliberate manipulation. We must address this directly, Edmund, and soon, Eleanor said. Whatever private understanding we reached in the library will mean nothing if 200 guests leave tonight, believing you have humiliated me before the entire gathering. What do you propose? Edmund asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity, alongside evident relief that Eleanor seemed prepared to help navigate this new crisis, rather than retreat into private hurt. Eleanor considered the question carefully, her mind returning to something her mother had once told her years before her marriage, advice about the power of gestures that spoke louder than any spoken denial or explanation. A public display, carefully chosen, might accomplish what words alone could never achieve quickly enough to matter. Leave that to me, she said finally, a plan crystallizing in her mind with sudden clarity. But I will need your trust, Edmund, and your willingness to follow my lead, regardless of how unusual my actions might appear in the moment. You have always had my trust, Eleanor, Edmund said quietly, even when I failed to demonstrate that trust through my own actions and secrecy. Eleanor nodded, accepting his words while filing away the deeper conversation about trust and honesty that would need to occur once tonight's crisis had been properly addressed. For now, she needed to act quickly, before Pemberton's careful poison spread any further through the assembled guests. She made her way toward Vivian, who was still engaged in conversation near the eastern windows, aware of Charlotte and Edmund watching from a short distance, uncertain what exactly Eleanor intended to do, but trusting her judgment enough to wait and observe. As Eleanor approached, the Countess of Ashford excused herself with a polite nod, perhaps sensing that the Duchess wished for private conversation with her guest. Vivian turned to face Eleanor, her expression carrying evident nervousness, clearly aware that the whispers circulating through the ballroom had grown considerably more pointed since their earlier private conversation. Your Grace, Vivian said quietly, I fear my presence here tonight has caused far more trouble than I ever intended. Perhaps, Eleanor said, studying the woman before her, with new understanding gained from their earlier conversation in the library. But trouble caused by misunderstanding can often be resolved through clarity, Miss Hart, if one is willing to act with sufficient boldness. Vivian's brow furrowed slightly with confusion. What do you mean, Your Grace? Eleanor glanced briefly toward the orchestra, noting that the current piece was drawing toward its natural conclusion, the musicians preparing to pause before beginning their next selection. This brief lull in the music would draw natural attention from the gathered guests, a moment when eyes would naturally turn toward the dance floor and the surrounding areas, waiting to see what might happen next. It was, Eleanor realized, the perfect moment for what she intended to do. Miss Hart, she said, straightening her posture and speaking with quiet but firm authority, I wonder if you might indulge me in a small gesture, one that I believe will serve both our interests rather significantly this evening. Of course, Your Grace, Vivian said, though uncertainty remained evident in her voice. Whatever you require. Eleanor took a steadying breath, aware that what she planned to do next would either resolve tonight's crisis definitively or create an entirely new scandal that would give Pemberton even more ammunition for his political schemes. But she had weighed the risks carefully, and she believed, with growing certainty, that boldness, rather than quiet denial, offered the only true path forward. The orchestra's music faded to silence, and in that brief pause before the next piece began, conversations throughout the ballroom naturally quieted as well, guests instinctively pausing to enjoy the momentary calm before resuming their evening's entertainment. Eleanor understood that this was her moment, the precise instant she had been waiting for since the idea first formed in her mind. Taking one final breath to steady her resolve, she prepared to act, fully aware that every eye in the ballroom would soon turn toward her and toward the gesture she was about to make, a gesture that would either restore order to this chaotic evening or shatter what remained of her careful composure entirely. Somewhere near the ballroom entrance, a guest dropped a fan, and the small clatter against the polished floor seemed to echo through the sudden hush like a gunshot. Eleanor felt every eye that had turned toward the momentary silence now shifting, almost imperceptibly, toward her and Vivian standing together near the eastern windows. She recognized the opportunity for exactly what it was, a rare moment when the entire room's attention gathered in one place, waiting for something, anything, to fill the quiet before the orchestra resumed its music. She reached out and gently took Vivian's hand, feeling the other woman's surprise ripple through her fingers at the unexpected contact. "Your Grace," Vivian whispered, clearly uncertain what Eleanor intended. "What are you doing?" "Trust me," Eleanor murmured back, her voice barely audible even to Vivian standing so close beside her. "Whatever happens next, simply follow my lead and allow the moment to unfold naturally." She raised their joined hands slightly, drawing even more attention from nearby guests who had begun to notice the unusual tableau forming near the windows. Edmund, watching from across the room with Charlotte beside him, straightened with visible tension, clearly uncertain what his wife intended, but trusting enough in her judgment to remain still and observe. Eleanor spoke then, her voice carrying clearly across the momentarily quiet ballroom, pitched perfectly to reach the ears of guests standing throughout the vast chamber, without seeming to shout or draw undue attention to the effort of being heard. "Friends," she began, "I understand there has been considerable speculation tonight regarding our guest, Miss Vivian Hart, and her connection to my husband." A visible ripple moved through the crowd, guests exchanging glances as they realized the Duchess herself intended to address the very rumors that had been circulating in hushed whispers throughout the evening. Eleanor felt her heart pounding rapidly, though her voice remained remarkably steady as she continued. "Miss Hart's brother, Captain Richard Hart, served with great honor alongside my husband during his years of military service, before circumstances beyond his control ended his career unjustly," Eleanor continued, choosing her words carefully to convey truth, without revealing more of Vivian's private family struggles than necessary. "Miss Hart came to us tonight, seeking assistance in restoring her brother's good name and securing proper support for his ongoing recovery from illness." She paused, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes fixed upon her, waiting to see where this unexpected address would lead. Pemberton stood near the refreshment table, his expression carefully neutral, though Eleanor could see the tension building in his rigid posture as he realized his carefully planted rumors were about to be publicly dismantled. "It would have been easy for my husband to turn away an old comrade's family in their time of need, particularly given the awkwardness such assistance might create within social circles, quick to assume the worst of any private conversation between a married man and a woman from his past," Eleanor continued. But Edmund chose instead to honor a debt of gratitude and friendship, offering his help, despite the risk, to his own reputation. She turned then to face Vivian directly, still holding the woman's hand within her own, and lowered herself into a graceful, deliberate curtsy, the kind reserved for greeting equals or honoring particular respect and admiration. A collective gasp moved through the assembled guests, the sound rippling outward from those closest to the scene, toward the far corners of the ballroom, where guests who could not see clearly began asking urgent questions of those standing nearer to the unfolding moment. Eleanor rose slowly from her curtsy, meeting Vivian's stunned expression with a small, genuine smile. "I offer this gesture of respect, Miss Hart, for the courage you have shown tonight in seeking help for your family, despite the personal risk such a request carried, given your history with my husband." Loyalty and love for one's family deserve recognition, regardless of the complications that history might create. The ballroom remained utterly silent, the orchestra members themselves pausing with instruments raised but unplayed, clearly uncertain whether to begin their next piece amid such an extraordinary scene. Eleanor could feel the weight of every gaze fixed upon her, could sense Edmund's stunned expression from across the room, could see Pemberton's carefully composed mask beginning to crack with visible frustration as his plans unraveled before the assembled guests. Vivian recovered first, sinking into her own curtsy with genuine emotion evident in her voice as she spoke. "Your Grace, I am deeply honored by your grace and understanding. I only hope my brother's recovery might one day allow us to properly repay such kindness." "There is no debt to repay, Miss Hart," Eleanor said warmly. "Family loyalty needs no repayment, only recognition and support when circumstances allow." The silence held for a moment longer before Charlotte, ever alert to social cues, began to clap softly, the sound spreading quickly as other guests joined in genuine appreciation for the touching display of compassion and grace they had just witnessed. The orchestra, taking this as their cue, resumed their music, the familiar strains filling the ballroom once more and breaking the tension that had gripped the room only moments before. Eleanor felt her heart still racing as conversations resumed around her, though the tone had shifted dramatically from the whispered speculation of before to something warmer, more admiring, as guests processed what they had just witnessed. She caught snippets of conversation as she moved back through the crowd, comments praising her graciousness, her compassion, her evident strength in addressing rumors directly, rather than allowing them to fester unaddressed. "Did you see how she handled that situation?" one countess whispered to her companion as Eleanor passed nearby. "What extraordinary poise, addressing such delicate matters with such grace." "I had heard rumors of impropriety," another guest murmured, "but clearly there was nothing improper at all, merely an old friend seeking help for family matters." How generous of the Duchess to show such understanding. Eleanor allowed herself a small measure of relief as she made her way toward Edmund, who stood waiting near the edge of the dance floor with an expression of mixed astonishment and profound gratitude. Charlotte fell into step beside her, practically glowing with pride at her friend's masterful handling of what could have become a devastating scandal. "Eleanor, that was remarkable," Charlotte whispered as they crossed the room together. "I have never witnessed anything quite so brilliantly executed in all my years attending society events." "I only hope it proves sufficient to silence Lord Pemberton's ambitions," Eleanor replied quietly, glancing toward the Earl, who now stood engaged in stilted conversation with several gentlemen, his earlier confident demeanor considerably diminished. When she reached Edmund, he took her hand gently, his eyes carrying an expression of gratitude so profound that Eleanor felt momentarily overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "Eleanor, I do not know how to properly thank you for what you just did. You have not only silenced the rumors, but transformed a potential scandal into a story of generosity and grace that will only enhance our family's reputation." "I did what needed to be done, Edmund," Eleanor said, though warmth crept into her voice despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Though do not mistake tonight's actions for forgiveness regarding your earlier secrecy. We still have much to discuss once our guests have departed." "I understand," Edmund said quietly, squeezing her hand gently, "and I welcome that conversation, whenever you are ready to have it." As the evening continued, Eleanor noticed a marked shift in the atmosphere throughout the ballroom. Guests who had earlier regarded her and Edmund with curious, speculative glances now approached with genuine warmth and admiration, several ladies specifically seeking her out to compliment her handling of the evening's unexpected drama. Even guests who had shown little interest in socializing with the Duchess before tonight now found themselves drawn to her presence, eager to bask in the reflected glow of her masterful social navigation. Pemberton approached her once more near the conclusion of the evening, his expression carefully neutral, though Eleanor could detect the frustration simmering beneath his polished exterior. "Your Grace," he said stiffly, "that was quite a display tonight. I must admit, I did not anticipate such a resolution to the evening's earlier confusion. Perhaps you underestimated the strength of family bonds and honest communication, Lord Pemberton," Eleanor replied, her tone perfectly pleasant, despite the pointed nature of her words. "Rumors, however carefully cultivated, tend to wither quickly when confronted directly with truth and genuine compassion." Something flickered across Pemberton's face. A brief acknowledgement that his schemes had been recognized and thwarted, though he maintained his composed exterior with practiced skill. "Indeed, Your Grace. I shall remember that lesson well." He excused himself shortly after, leaving Eleanor to reflect on the strange satisfaction of watching a would-be adversary retreat in quiet defeat. Whatever ambitions Pemberton had harbored regarding tonight's scandal, they had crumbled entirely in the face of her bold and carefully calculated gesture. As the ball began winding toward its natural conclusion, guests gradually taking their leave with warm farewells and compliments about the evening's success, Eleanor found herself standing near the grand entrance beside Edmund, both of them exhausted but relieved as the final carriages departed down the moonlit drive. Margaret approached them as the last guests said their goodbyes, her expression carrying an unusual softness that Eleanor had rarely witnessed from her formidable mother-in-law. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "what you did tonight required extraordinary courage and wisdom. I confess, I did not believe any woman could navigate such treacherous waters with the grace you demonstrated." "Thank you, Margaret," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the rare compliment, "though I fear the true test still awaits, once Edmund and I have the opportunity to speak privately about everything that has transpired tonight." Margaret nodded knowingly, understanding that the public triumph of tonight's ball masked deeper, more private conversations still needing to occur between husband and wife. "Whatever difficulties you face in private, Eleanor, know that you have proven yourself a duchess worthy of this family's name and legacy. That knowledge alone should provide some comfort as you navigate whatever conversations lie ahead." As the final guests disappeared into the night, and servants began the lengthy process of restoring the ballroom to its normal quiet elegance, Eleanor turned to Edmund, understanding that the true reckoning of tonight's events still waited for them, away from the watching eyes of society, in the privacy of their own chambers. The heavy front doors had barely closed behind the last departing carriage when Eleanor felt her legs suddenly weaken beneath her, the accumulated strain of the entire evening finally catching up with her exhausted body. Edmund noticed immediately, reaching out to steady her with a gentle hand at her elbow. "Eleanor, are you unwell?" "Simply tired," she said, though the trembling in her voice suggested exhaustion ran deeper than mere physical fatigue. "Tonight has asked more of me than perhaps any single evening of our marriage." "Come, sit with me in the drawing room," Edmund said quietly, guiding her away from the bustling activity of servants clearing the ballroom, and toward the quieter comfort of a smaller sitting room down the hall. "We have much to discuss, and I would rather do so somewhere you can rest properly, rather than standing in exhausted exhaustion near the entrance." Eleanor allowed him to lead her, grateful for the support, as the adrenaline that had carried her through the evening's dramatic events finally began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made even simple movement feel like considerable effort. They settled into the drawing room, Edmund pouring 2 small glasses of brandy from the decanter kept near the fireplace, offering one to Eleanor despite knowing she rarely partook of spirits. "I believe tonight warrants an exception," he said, a small smile touching his lips as she accepted the glass with a grateful nod. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the crackling fire providing the only sound in the otherwise quiet room, both husband and wife gathering their thoughts before the difficult conversation that still needed to occur between them. "Eleanor," Edmund said finally, breaking the silence, "I owe you an explanation far more complete than what I offered earlier tonight in the library. You deserve the full truth, not merely the pieces I shared while trying to manage an immediate crisis." Eleanor set her glass down carefully, meeting his gaze with steady attention. "I am listening, Edmund." He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Vivienne and I met when I was barely 20 years old, newly commissioned into military service, and eager to prove myself worthy of my family's expectations. She was the daughter of a modest merchant family living near the barracks where I was stationed, and we formed a friendship that gradually deepened into something more serious over the course of nearly 2 years." Eleanor asked directly, though her voice remained steady despite the weight of the question. "I believed I did, at the time," Edmund admitted. "Young love often feels absolute and unshakable, particularly when circumstances have not yet tested its true strength against the practical demands of duty and family expectation. When my father learned of the relationship, he made it abundantly clear that any serious connection with a woman of Vivienne's modest background would be entirely unacceptable, given the responsibilities I would eventually inherit as Duke. "So you ended things between you," Eleanor said quietly. "I did," Edmund confirmed, guilt evident in his voice, though not without considerable pain on both sides. Vivian understood the constraints placed upon me by my position, even as the separation caused her genuine heartbreak. We parted ways, and I threw myself fully into my military duties, and eventually into the responsibilities of managing my family's estates once my father's health began declining. "And Richard Hart," Eleanor said, connecting the pieces of tonight's story. "He was Vivian's brother, serving alongside you." "Yes," Edmund said. "I did not immediately connect the sister who visited our barracks with the young captain who served under my command, until circumstances eventually revealed their relationship. By then, Richard had become a trusted friend and comrade, someone whose skill and courage I genuinely admired, regardless of my earlier romantic history with his sister." "What happened to end his military career?" Eleanor asked, curious about this piece of the story that remained largely unexplained. Edmund's expression grew troubled as he considered how to explain the complicated circumstances. There was an incident during a training exercise that went terribly wrong, resulting in serious injuries to several soldiers under Richard's immediate command. The official investigation placed blame squarely on Richard's shoulders, accusing him of negligence in properly overseeing the exercise's safety protocols. "But you believe this accusation was unfair," Eleanor said, remembering Vivian's earlier insistence that her brother had been wrongly blamed. "I know it was unfair," Edmund said firmly. "I witnessed the events leading to that incident myself, and the true fault lay with equipment failures that predated Richard's command entirely, failures that certain officers higher in the chain of command wished to conceal rather than acknowledge their own oversight failures. Richard became a convenient scapegoat, his career and reputation sacrificed to protect men with greater political influence and connections. Why did you not speak up at the time to defend him?" Eleanor asked, though her tone carried curiosity rather than accusation. Edmund's expression grew pained with evident regret. "I was young, Eleanor, still building my own reputation within military circles, still uncertain of my standing and influence. I told myself that speaking up would accomplish nothing beyond damaging my own prospects, without actually helping Richard, whose fate had already been decided by officers far more senior than myself. It was a cowardly justification, one I have regretted for years since." Eleanor absorbed this confession quietly, understanding now the full weight of guilt Edmund had carried regarding his former friend's unjust treatment. "And tonight, Vivian came seeking your help in finally correcting this old injustice." "Yes," Edmund confirmed. "I possess documentation from that time, records I preserved, specifically because I always intended to eventually help clear Richard's name, though I confess, I allowed years to pass without taking proper action. When Vivian wrote to me several months ago explaining her brother's declining health and the financial hardships facing their family, I felt compelled finally to act, to use whatever influence I now possess, as Duke, to correct a wrong I should have addressed years earlier." "Why did you invite her to the ball, rather than simply arranging a private meeting elsewhere?" Eleanor asked, returning to the practical question that had started tonight's entire crisis. "A mistake born of poor planning, and perhaps some misguided sentiment," Edmund admitted. "I had intended to meet with her privately before the ball, to discuss the documentation and arrangements needed to help Richard, then quietly withdraw the invitation, to spare you any discomfort about her presence at our social event. But circumstances delayed our planned meeting, and by the time she arrived tonight, there was no graceful way to prevent her attendance, without creating exactly the kind of scene we ultimately faced regardless." Eleanor considered everything Edmund had shared, weighing the complicated truth against the fear and confusion that had consumed her throughout the evening. "Edmund, why did you never share any of this history with me before tonight? 6 years of marriage, and I knew nothing of Vivian Hart, nothing of Richard's unjust treatment, nothing of the guilt you have apparently carried regarding your failure to help him sooner." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, as he searched for words to properly explain his years of silence. "I suppose I feared that sharing this history would somehow diminish what we have built together, that acknowledging past feelings for another woman, however long since surrendered, might create doubt or insecurity in your mind about the strength of our own marriage." "Your silence created far more doubt and insecurity than honesty ever could have, Edmund," Eleanor said, though her voice carried understanding, rather than harsh judgment. "Tonight, watching you disappear with Vivian into private conversation, imagining the worst possible explanations for your secrecy. I felt more distrust and fear than any honest conversation about your past could have caused. You are right, Edmund acknowledged quietly. I have been a coward in this matter, choosing comfortable silence over difficult honesty, and tonight's crisis is the direct result of that cowardice. Eleanor reached out and took his hand gently, feeling the tension in his fingers gradually relax at her touch. I do not wish to dwell excessively on past mistakes, Edmund. What matters now is how we move forward from tonight's revelations. I need your promise that such secrecy will not continue defining our marriage, that whatever difficult truths exist in your past or your present, you will trust me enough to share them, rather than allowing me to imagine scenarios far more damaging than reality itself. You have my complete promise, Eleanor, Edmund said, his voice thick with emotion. Tonight has taught me a painful but necessary lesson about the cost of secrecy, even secrecy motivated by good intentions and fear of causing you distress. I will not make this same mistake again. They sat together in comfortable silence for several more minutes, the fire slowly dying down as the late hour finally caught up with both of them. Eleanor felt something settling within her chest, not quite full forgiveness yet, but the beginning of a renewed trust, built upon honest conversation, rather than careful pretense. What of Richard's situation? She asked finally. What will you do to help restore his reputation and support his recovery? I intend to formally submit documentation to the appropriate military authorities, clearing his name of the false accusations that ended his career, Edmund said. Additionally, I plan to provide financial support directly to help with his medical care, regardless of how quickly the official process of clearing his reputation might proceed. I would like to be involved in that process as well, Eleanor said, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. Vivienne showed considerable courage tonight, seeking help despite the personal risk and awkwardness such a request carried. Given her history with you, I would like to extend whatever support our family can offer, both for Richard's recovery and for Vivienne's own future welfare. Edmund studied her with evident surprise and growing admiration. Eleanor, your generosity continues to astonish me, even after 6 years of marriage. Perhaps you have simply never given me sufficient opportunity to demonstrate it fully, Eleanor said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time since their private conversation began. Trust works both directions, Edmund. If I ask you to share difficult truths with me, I must also show myself capable of responding to those truths with compassion, rather than jealousy or judgment. As the last embers of the fire glowed softly in the darkened room, Eleanor felt a fragile but genuine sense of peace beginning to settle over the chaos of the evening's events. Tonight had tested their marriage in ways she never anticipated, had revealed secrets and fears that had remained hidden for years, but it had also demonstrated a resilience and capacity for honest communication that gave her genuine hope for whatever challenges their future together might yet bring. A folded newspaper landed on the breakfast table with a sharp slap, and Eleanor looked up to find Charlotte standing over her, practically vibrating with excitement despite the early hour. Eleanor, you must read this immediately, Charlotte said, pushing the paper toward her friend before even properly greeting her. All of London is discussing nothing else this morning. Eleanor set down her teacup and unfolded the paper carefully, scanning the society pages until her eyes landed on a headline that made her breath catch slightly. The article described last night's ball in glowing terms, praising the elegant decorations and excellent musical selections. But the true focus of the piece centered entirely on what the writer called an extraordinary display of grace and compassion from the young Duchess of Bramwell. They are calling it the most talked-about moment of the entire social season, Charlotte said, practically bouncing with enthusiasm as Eleanor continued reading. Every drawing room in London will be discussing your gesture toward Miss Hart for weeks to come. Eleanor finished the article and set the paper down, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and continued unease. The public reception of last night's events had certainly exceeded her hopeful expectations, transforming what could have been a devastating scandal into a story that enhanced rather than damaged her family's reputation. Yet she remained acutely aware that private matters between herself and Edmund still required considerable rebuilding, regardless of society's approval of her public handling of the crisis. I confess I did not anticipate quite such an enthusiastic response, Eleanor admitted, accepting fresh tea from a passing servant. I hoped merely to silence Pemberton's schemes and prevent lasting damage to Edmund's reputation. I did not expect to become the subject of admiring gossip throughout the city. You underestimate your own cleverness, my dear, Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor, with evident satisfaction. That gesture, the curtsy, the public explanation, it was pure brilliance. You transformed potential scandal into a demonstration of your character that no one could argue against without appearing petty and small-minded themselves. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile at her friend's enthusiasm, though her thoughts drifted quickly back to more practical concerns. What of Lord Pemberton? Have you heard anything regarding his reaction to how thoroughly his plans unraveled last night? Charlotte's expression grew more serious as she considered the question. I have heard some interesting developments on that front, actually. It seems several of the gentlemen who witnessed Pemberton's earlier attempts to spread rumors about you and Edmund have grown rather suspicious of his motives, particularly once your gesture so thoroughly demonstrated the innocent explanation behind Miss Hart's presence. What do you mean? Eleanor asked, curious about this new development. Apparently, Lord Whitmore, one of the gentlemen overseeing the appointment Pemberton and Edmund both hoped to secure, remarked quite pointedly to several colleagues that a man willing to spread unfounded rumors about a fellow peer's marriage, purely for personal political advantage, demonstrates precisely the kind of character unsuited to positions of public trust and responsibility, Charlotte explained, clear satisfaction evident in her voice. Eleanor felt a small measure of vindication at this news, though she took no particular pleasure in Pemberton's apparent downfall, so his scheming may have ultimately damaged his own prospects rather than Edmund's. It would seem so, Charlotte confirmed, though I understand the final decision regarding the appointment has not yet been formally announced. Still, the shift in perception among the deciding parties appears rather significant, given how quickly gossip travels through those particular circles of influence. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Grace, Eleanor's lady's maid, carrying a small card on a silver tray. Your Grace, a messenger has just arrived with correspondence from Miss Vivian Hart. Eleanor accepted the card with mild surprise, quickly reading the brief but heartfelt note Vivian had penned that morning. The letter expressed profound gratitude for Eleanor's generous public gesture the previous evening, along with an update regarding Richard's condition, which apparently remains stable, though still requiring careful medical attention. She writes that her brother's physician believes proper documentation clearing his military reputation, along with continued financial support for his care, offers genuine hope for meaningful recovery, Eleanor said, sharing the contents with Charlotte. She also extends an invitation for tea sometime this week, if I remain willing to discuss further ways our families might assist in Richard's ongoing situation. Will you accept? Charlotte asked. I believe I shall, Eleanor said thoughtfully, though I confess the prospect still carries some lingering complexity, given everything that has transpired between our families. Still, genuine kindness deserves follow-through, not merely a single grand gesture performed for public benefit and then forgotten once the immediate crisis has passed. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself alone in her private sitting room, finally allowing herself a quiet moment to process everything that had occurred over the previous 24 hours. The public triumph of last night's ball provided welcome relief from the immediate crisis, but private questions still lingered in her mind, questions about trust and honesty that required careful consideration before she could fully move forward from the events that had so thoroughly tested her marriage. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret entered without waiting for formal permission, as was her usual custom when visiting Eleanor's private chambers. Eleanor, dear, Margaret said, settling into a chair near the window with characteristic directness. I wish to speak with you privately regarding yesterday's events, away from the excitement and gossip currently consuming the rest of society. Of course, Margaret, Eleanor said, curious about what her formidable mother-in-law wished to discuss. I have watched you carefully these past 6 years, Eleanor, since the day Edmund first brought you to Bramwell Hall as his bride, Margaret began, her tone carrying unusual warmth. I confess I harbored certain doubts initially about whether you possessed sufficient strength and cleverness to navigate the complicated politics of our social position. Last night, you proved those doubts entirely misplaced. Eleanor felt genuine surprise at this rare admission from a woman known throughout London for her sharp criticism and exacting standards. Thank you, Margaret. Your words mean a great deal to me. I do not offer such compliments lightly, as you well know, Margaret continued. But beyond simple praise for your public performance, I wish to address something more private between us. Edmund has confided in me regarding the deeper conversation you two shared following the ball's conclusion, regarding his past history with Vivian Hart, and his years of silence about that history. He has spoken with you about our private conversation? Eleanor asked, somewhat surprised that Edmund would share such personal matters with his mother so quickly. Only briefly, and only because he sought my perspective on how best to properly support you moving forward, Margaret clarified. Eleanor, I want you to understand something important about my son. Edmund has always struggled with expressing difficult emotions directly, a trait he inherited partly from his father, who similarly preferred silence over vulnerability when facing complicated personal matters. That does not excuse 6 years of secrecy regarding such significant history, Eleanor said, though her tone carried more curiosity than accusation. No, it does not, Margaret agreed readily. But understanding the root of his tendency toward silence might help you navigate future conversations with greater patience and effectiveness, should similar situations arise, requiring honest communication between you. Eleanor considered this advice carefully, recognizing the genuine care behind Margaret's words, despite her usually stern exterior. I appreciate your guidance, Margaret. I only hope Edmund and I can build a stronger foundation of honesty moving forward, one that does not require such dramatic crises to force important conversations into the open. That, my dear, depends largely on both your continued efforts, Margaret said, rising from her chair with characteristic briskness. But I have faith in your evident strength and wisdom, qualities you demonstrated abundantly last night for all of London to witness. As Margaret departed, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable shift in her relationship with her mother-in-law, a woman whose approval had always felt difficult to earn throughout the early years of her marriage. Perhaps last night's crisis, painful and frightening as it had been in the moment, had ultimately strengthened not only her marriage to Edmund, but also her broader standing within the complicated family dynamics of Bramwell Hall. She spent the remainder of the afternoon attending to household matters, responding to numerous invitations and correspondence that had arrived following news of last night's dramatic events, each letter carrying warm praise for her graceful handling of the evening's unexpected complications. By the time evening arrived and she prepared for a quiet dinner with Edmund, Eleanor felt a cautious optimism beginning to replace the anxiety and confusion that had consumed her thoughts since first learning of Vivian Hart's unexpected arrival at their winter ball. Whatever challenges still remained in fully rebuilding trust within her marriage, last night had demonstrated something important about her own capabilities, her own strength and cleverness in navigating crisis with grace rather than panic. As she dressed for dinner, catching her reflection in the mirror with new appreciation for the woman staring back at her, Eleanor understood that whatever came next in her marriage and her life within London society, she now possessed clear evidence of her own considerable resilience and capability, evidence that would serve her well, regardless of whatever future complications might eventually arise. The teacup shattered against the hearth before Eleanor even realized her own hand had trembled enough to lose its grip, the sharp sound startling her from thoughts that had grown increasingly tense as the appointed hour for her meeting with Vivian Hart drew closer. Grace rushed forward immediately to clean the mess, though Eleanor waved away her assistance, kneeling herself to gather the broken pieces, while her mind continued racing through the conversation she anticipated having within the hour. 3 days had passed since the ball, 3 days of cautious rebuilding between herself and Edmund, punctuated by careful conversations that felt simultaneously healing and exhausting. Your Grace, please, allow me, Grace insisted, finally convincing Eleanor to step back, while she properly cleared away the shattered porcelain. You seem rather distracted this afternoon. Forgive me, Grace, Eleanor said, straightening her gown and attempting to compose herself before Vivian's scheduled arrival. I confess, this meeting carries more weight than I initially anticipated when I extended the invitation. She made her way to the drawing room, where she had arranged to receive Vivian, taking a moment to steady her breathing before the woman arrived. Their previous encounters had been shaped entirely by crisis and public performance. First, the tense confrontation in the library, then the carefully orchestrated public gesture designed to silence damaging gossip. This meeting would be different, a private conversation between two women whose lives had become unexpectedly intertwined through circumstances neither had fully chosen for themselves. When Vivian arrived precisely on schedule, Eleanor noted the woman's own evident nervousness, a stark contrast to the confident composure she had displayed at the ball just days earlier. Perhaps the absence of an audience, the intimacy of private conversation, rather than public performance, created its own particular pressure that neither woman had needed to navigate previously. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving me," Vivian said, settling into the offered chair with careful precision. "I confess, I was uncertain whether your invitation reflected genuine sentiment or merely social obligation following the events of the ball. I extend invitations only when I mean them sincerely, Miss Hart," Eleanor replied, pouring tea for them both, with steady hands, despite her earlier moment of nervous distraction. "Please, tell me how your brother fares. I have thought of his recovery often since our previous conversation." Vivian's expression shifted with genuine emotion as she discussed Richard's condition. "His physician reports cautious improvement, particularly since Edmund's documentation reached the appropriate military authorities earlier this week. The formal process of clearing his name will take additional time, but simply knowing that truth is finally being acknowledged has lifted Richard's spirits considerably, which the physician believes contributes meaningfully to his physical recovery as well." "I am relieved to hear such positive news," Eleanor said sincerely. "Edmund mentioned he intends to provide continued financial support for Richard's medical care, regardless of how quickly the official documentation process proceeds." "Your family's generosity continues to astonish me, Your Grace," Vivian said, genuine gratitude evident in her voice. "I confess I arrived at your ball prepared for a much different reception than the compassion you have shown, both publicly and now privately." Eleanor considered her next words carefully, recognizing that this conversation offered opportunity for deeper understanding between them, understanding that might help settle lingering uncertainties still troubling her own thoughts despite the public triumph of the ball itself. "Miss Hart, may I ask you something rather direct?" "Of course, Your Grace. When you look at Edmund now, after all these years, what do you feel?" Eleanor asked, meeting Vivian's gaze steadily, despite the vulnerability inherent in such a personal question. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering her answer with care, rather than offering a quick, potentially insincere response. "I feel gratitude, Your Grace, for the man he has become, for the honor he has shown in finally helping correct the injustice done to my brother. I feel some lingering sadness for the young man I once knew, whose path diverged so completely from the future we briefly imagined together as foolish young people barely out of childhood ourselves. But not romantic feeling," Eleanor pressed gently. "No," Vivian said firmly, her voice carrying genuine conviction. "Whatever affection existed between us belongs entirely to the past, Your Grace. Edmund built a life with you, a life clearly filled with genuine partnership and mutual respect, judging by how thoroughly you both navigated the crisis at your ball. I would never wish to disrupt something so evidently valuable and well-constructed, particularly not for the sake of nostalgic sentiment about a relationship that ended appropriately many years ago." Eleanor felt something ease within her chest at these words, recognizing the sincerity behind Vivian's careful explanation. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Hart. I confess this conversation provides considerable comfort, beyond even the public reassurance offered by our gesture at the ball. May I ask you something in return, Your Grace?" Vivian asked, her expression carrying evident curiosity. "Please. Do you forgive Edmund fully, for the secrecy he maintained regarding our history throughout your marriage?" Vivian asked, her tone gentle despite the directness of the question. Eleanor considered this carefully, recognizing that Vivian's question touched precisely upon the lingering uncertainty she had continued wrestling with in the days since the ball. "I am working toward forgiveness," she admitted honestly. "The public crisis has been resolved, and society now views our family with renewed admiration rather than suspicion. But privately, Edmund and I continue navigating the deeper questions his secrecy raised about trust and honest communication within our marriage." "That seems a wise and measured response," Vivian said thoughtfully. "Forgiveness offered too quickly, without proper reflection, often proves less durable than forgiveness reached through genuine consideration and honest conversation." They continued their conversation for nearly an hour, discussing lighter topics eventually, including Vivian's own plans for the future, once Richard's health and reputation had been properly restored. Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying the woman's company, recognizing qualities of intelligence and resilience that reminded her somewhat of her own journey, navigating the complicated expectations placed upon women within their particular level of society. As their meeting concluded and Vivian prepared to depart, she paused at the drawing room door, turning back to face Eleanor with an expression of genuine warmth. "Your Grace, I hope you know that whatever gratitude I feel toward your family extends beyond simple appreciation for financial and political assistance regarding Richard's situation. Your kindness toward me personally, despite every reasonable justification you might have had for treating me with suspicion or hostility, has meant a great deal. We are simply two women navigating complicated circumstances. Neither of us fully chose for ourselves, Miss Hart," Eleanor replied warmly. "I see no reason why such circumstances should prevent genuine friendship, should we both wish to pursue it." After Vivian departed, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the conversation with considerable satisfaction, recognizing that this private meeting had accomplished something the public gesture at the ball could not achieve alone: a genuine settling of her own private doubts and insecurities regarding Vivian's true feelings toward Edmund. That evening, as she and Edmund shared a quiet dinner together, Eleanor shared details of her conversation with Vivian, watching her husband's expression carefully as she recounted the discussion. "I am glad you found the conversation reassuring," Edmund said once she had finished sharing the details. "Though I confess, Eleanor, I still carry considerable guilt regarding the pain my secrecy caused you throughout these past days. Guilt serves little purpose if it does not lead to genuine change, Edmund," Eleanor said gently, though her tone carried firm conviction. "What matters now is how we proceed from this point forward. I need you to understand clearly that I require honesty from you, particularly regarding matters that might significantly affect our marriage or our family's reputation, regardless of how uncomfortable such honesty might feel in difficult moments. You have my complete commitment to that honesty, Eleanor," Edmund said, his voice carrying evident sincerity. "I have learned, through considerable pain and near disaster, exactly how costly secrecy can become when significant truths remain hidden for too long. Then let us consider this crisis, painful as it was, ultimately a valuable lesson for our marriage," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to take his hand gently. "We have both learned important truths about trust and communication, lessons that will hopefully strengthen rather than weaken our partnership as we continue building our life together." "I could not agree more," Edmund said, bringing her hand to his lips with genuine tenderness. "Eleanor, I promise you, whatever challenges we face in the future, you will never again need to wonder about secrets I might be keeping from you. You have proven yourself, not merely a capable Duchess, but a true partner in every sense that matters, someone whose strength and wisdom I deeply respect and admire." As their dinner continued, conversation flowing more easily now than it had in the tense days immediately following the ball, Eleanor felt genuine hope settling over her heart regarding the future of their marriage. Whatever crisis had briefly threatened to unravel everything she had carefully built over 6 years as Duchess of Bramwell, she now understood that the foundation of her marriage, while tested severely, remained fundamentally strong, strengthened rather than weakened by the honest conversations that crisis had ultimately forced into the open between herself and Edmund. A letter arrived at Bramwell Hall, bearing military seals so official that even the footman delivering it seemed to understand its significance before Eleanor had broken the wax to read its contents. She tore into the envelope with trembling fingers, standing in the entrance hall rather than waiting the few moments necessary to reach a proper sitting room, her eyes scanning the formal language until she found the words she had been anxiously awaiting for nearly 2 months. The document confirmed, in official military language, that Captain Richard Hart's record had been formally cleared of all previous accusations, his commission and honor fully restored, along with a formal acknowledgement of the equipment failures that had truly caused the original incident years earlier. "Edmund," Eleanor called out, hurrying through the hallways until she found her husband in his study, reviewing estate documents with characteristic concentration. "It has arrived. Richard's name has been officially cleared." Edmund looked up immediately, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to genuine relief as Eleanor handed him the official letter. He read through it quickly, his shoulders visibly relaxing as he absorbed the confirmation of what months of careful effort had finally accomplished. "After all these years," he said quietly, setting the letter down on his desk with evident satisfaction. Finally, justice has been properly served. 2 months had passed since the winter ball that had so thoroughly tested Eleanor's marriage and revealed secrets neither she nor Edmund had anticipated confronting so dramatically. In that time, their relationship had steadily strengthened, built upon a foundation of honest communication that neither had fully appreciated during the earlier years of their union, when comfortable silence had sometimes substituted for genuine vulnerability and truth. Vivienne had visited Bramwell Hall on several occasions since their initial private meeting, their friendship developing genuinely rather than remaining merely a polite arrangement necessitated by circumstance. Richard's health had improved steadily as well, the physician's earlier predictions proving accurate as proper documentation and continued financial support allowed him access to treatments and care that had previously remained beyond his family's reach. Society's fascination with the events of that particular winter ball had gradually faded, as newer scandals and social intrigues captured collective attention, though Eleanor occasionally still encountered guests eager to discuss the memorable evening whenever her name arose in fashionable conversation. Lord Pemberton, she had learned through various channels of gossip, had ultimately failed to secure the political appointment he had so desperately sought, the position instead awarded to a candidate whose character had never been called into question through attempted manipulation and scandal-mongering. Edmund's own reputation, rather than suffering damage from the crisis, had emerged considerably strengthened, society viewing his willingness to honor old friendships and correct past injustices as evidence of exactly the kind of honorable character deserving greater positions of trust and responsibility within their community. Several months after the ball, he received his own formal invitation to join an important parliamentary committee, an appointment that carried genuine influence and prestige within London's political circles. "We should celebrate this news properly," Eleanor said, referring to Richard's officially restored reputation. "Perhaps a small gathering, nothing so grand as our winter ball, but something to properly mark this important resolution." "I think that an excellent idea," Edmund agreed, "though I suspect Vivienne and Richard would prefer something more intimate than another large society event, given everything their family has endured these past years." "Then let us arrange a quiet dinner, just our closest friends and family," Eleanor suggested. "Charlotte, of course, and Henry, along with Vivienne and Richard once he feels strong enough to travel and attend such an occasion." That evening, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that fateful winter ball. She had entered that evening as a duchess primarily defined by her husband's position and family name, a woman who had spent 6 years learning to navigate society's expectations while quietly suppressing her own doubts and insecurities beneath practiced composure. The crisis of that single evening had forced her to discover reserves of strength and cleverness she had not fully recognized within herself previously. The public gesture that had silenced Pemberton's scheming rumors had demonstrated not merely social skill, but genuine courage, a willingness to act decisively under enormous pressure rather than retreating into safe passivity while allowing circumstances to determine her fate. Margaret's continued warmth toward her, so different from the more reserved relationship they had shared during the earlier years of Eleanor's marriage, provided additional confirmation of how thoroughly that single evening had transformed perceptions of her capabilities and character within her own family, not merely within broader London society. As she settled into bed beside Edmund that night, Eleanor found herself thinking of the woman she had been on, the morning before that winter ball, anxious and uncertain, defined largely by expectations others held for her role as Duchess. The woman she had become since that evening felt fundamentally different, more confident in her own judgment, more willing to trust her instincts even when circumstances demanded bold action, rather than safe conformity to established social conventions. "You seem thoughtful this evening," Edmund observed, noticing her contemplative silence. "I was simply reflecting on how much has changed since that winter ball," Eleanor said, turning to face him in the soft candlelight of their bedchamber. "I feel as though I discovered something important about myself that evening, something I might never have recognized had circumstances not forced me toward such difficult, immediate action." "You discovered your own remarkable strength," Edmund said quietly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face with gentle affection. "Though I suspect that strength existed within you all along, simply waiting for circumstances to reveal it fully, both to yourself and to everyone around you." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed thoughtfully, "though I confess, I would not wish to repeat such a dramatic method of self-discovery. One winter ball crisis feels quite sufficient for an entire lifetime. Edmund laughed softly at this, pulling her closer with evident affection. I believe I can safely promise no further uninvited guests from my past will arrive to disrupt future social gatherings, my dear. Though I make no guarantees regarding whatever other unexpected challenges life might yet present us. As long as we continue facing such challenges honestly, together, rather than allowing secrecy to complicate matters unnecessarily, I believe we shall manage whatever comes, Eleanor said, genuine confidence evident in her voice. The following week, their small celebratory dinner proceeded exactly as Eleanor had envisioned, an intimate gathering of close friends and family, celebrating Richard's restored honor and improving health. Richard himself attended, still recovering, but clearly strengthened by the formal acknowledgement of his innocence. His gratitude toward Edmund and Eleanor, evident throughout the warm evening of conversation and celebration. Vivian, seated beside Charlotte during dinner, had developed a genuine friendship with Eleanor's closest confidant over the preceding months. The three women, often meeting for tea and conversation, that had nothing whatsoever to do with the dramatic circumstances that had first brought them together. Henry, ever the loyal family friend, offered warm toasts throughout the evening, celebrating both Richard's restored reputation and the evident strength of Edmund and Eleanor's marriage, which had emerged from crisis considerably strengthened rather than damaged. As the evening drew to its natural conclusion, guests departing with warm farewells and genuine expressions of continued friendship, Eleanor found herself standing beside Edmund near the entrance of Bramwell Hall, watching the final carriage disappear down the moonlit drive. A rather different conclusion to an evening than our winter ball provided, Edmund observed, a note of gentle humor in his voice. Considerably calmer, thankfully, Eleanor agreed, leaning contentedly against her husband's shoulder. Though I suppose we have that earlier chaotic evening to thank for the genuine friendships and restored justice we celebrated tonight. Strange how crisis sometimes leads toward outcomes far better than anything we might have planned deliberately, Edmund mused. Perhaps that is simply the nature of genuine growth, Eleanor said thoughtfully. It rarely arrives through comfortable, predictable circumstances. Sometimes it requires the kind of difficult challenge that forces us to discover strength and wisdom we did not previously recognize within ourselves. As they turned back toward their home, walking together through the quiet halls that had witnessed both crisis and celebration over the preceding months, Eleanor felt genuine peace settling over her heart. She had entered that winter ball as a woman uncertain of her own capabilities, defined largely by external expectations and careful social performance. She emerged from the months that followed as a woman who had discovered her own considerable strength, wisdom, and capacity for both compassion and decisive action when circumstances demanded nothing less. Whatever future challenges awaited her and Edmund as they continued building their life together, Eleanor understood now, with quiet confidence, that she possessed everything necessary to navigate them successfully. The Duchess, who had bowed before an unexpected guest at her own winter ball, silencing an entire ballroom with a single graceful gesture, had discovered not merely a solution to that evening's immediate crisis, but a deeper truth about her own remarkable character that would continue serving her well throughout whatever chapters of her life still awaited discovery in the years ahead.